I think it's time now to get through to Skype to listen to our colleague. Are you okay?
So, Excellencies, distinguished members of the UNFCCC Standing Committee on Finance, dear delegates, ladies and gentlemen, good morning, good afternoon. Let me start by thanking the SCF Secretariat for having given me the opportunity to provide reflections for the session 2 on infrastructure investment trends and investment gaps. My reflections will be in the context of the Africa Climate Resilient Investment Facility, AFRIRES. AFRIRES is a joint initiative of the Economic Commission for Africa, the World Bank, the African Union Commission, the African Development Bank, with initial funding from the Nordic Development Fund. In the intervention of His Excellency Paul Kelly, he reminded us of the urgency for climate action and the need to front-load future climate finance now so that we can take climate action on mitigation, infrastructure development, adaptation, so that we can save our future, our common future now. Ms. Schneider-Roos's presentations has also made some very, very important points, especially on what we mean by climate resilience, important points on the quality aspect of climate resilience, which we cannot readily quantify, and indeed on the sheer magnitude of the investments that are needed globally to close the infrastructure gap, and also, very importantly, on the need for data and climate information. For us, climate resilient infrastructure is one that performs very well in both today's and tomorrow's climate. And we know that there are many future climates or scenarios. Therefore, we think that as such, when you integrate climate resilience in infrastructure development, it represents a dividend, but it is a dividend that comes with an incremental upfront cost, but which can be recovered over the lifetime of the project because of the performance of the project in this uncertain future climate. So for us in Africa, this is very important because the post-2015 development agenda on the continent is framed by the UN 2030 Agenda for Sustainable Development, aimed at leaving no one behind, and the wider African Union Agenda 2063, the Africa we want. So to transform African economies to attain these development objectives will require widespread access to modern and sustainable infrastructure and infrastructure services in ecosystems, water, transport, and so on. Indeed, if you look in the Agenda 2063, there is an important phrase I like very much. It says that the Agenda 2063 emphasizes and envisages a world-class integrative infrastructure that crosses the continent as a key requirement for achieving the African Renaissance. But yet we know that the continent still suffers a huge chronic infrastructure deficit in all sectors, as well as poor quality infrastructure and expensive infrastructure services compared to other parts of the world. But we know also that the Program for Infrastructure Development in Africa, PIDA, which was endorsed by heads of states in 2012, lays out a very big ambition to close that gap. We also heard in our senior Mrs. Schneider's presentation these huge investments that are needed. And for us in Africa, the World Bank estimates that we will need something close to 100 billion a year to close the huge infrastructure gap. But we also want to emphasize that we see this infrastructure deficit in Africa both as an opportunity and as a challenge. The challenge is that how do we use limited public resources to close such a big gap against increasing demand? And how do we ensure that the investments that are made today do not become stranded assets in the future owing to the adverse? The opportunity lies in adopting a new climate economy approach to developing Africa's infrastructure, i.e. an approach in which economic growth and sustainability are seen as two sides of the same coin. As such, we say what we normally say here, that we have a latecomer advantage, and therefore we have a latecomer advantage that we starting from a low base, and we therefore have the opportunity to learn from what other regions have done, to use what is now readily available to ensure that we can leapfrog and become leaders in climate resilient infrastructure. Also in His Excellency Paul Kelly's presentation, we were reminded of the living evidence of the adverse impacts of climate change. In Africa, we have limited infrastructure, as already mentioned, but that limited infrastructure is already being very adversely affected by the extreme climate events. For example, in 2016, the Rabat Dam almost lost production because of the unusual El Nino and La Nino events, which now can be attributed to climate change impacts in recent years. In 2015, the World Bank and the Economic Commission for Africa carried out a study and published a report on enhancing the climate resilience of Africa's infrastructure, ECRI. The study found that if we fail to integrate climate change in the planning and design of power and water infrastructure, that could entail losses of hydropower production of between 5 to 60%, depending on the basin, and also foregone revenues in the range of 15 to 130% of the baseline value. Similarly, in the transport sector, the study found that failing to integrate climate resilience could lead to a shortening in the life cycle of roads rehabilitation, which then would entail very high increases in the maintenance and periodic rehabilitation costs of transport infrastructure. So the results of the ECRI work then led us to say that we need to support African countries urgently so that they can be able to design, plan, and implement the infrastructure to perform against uncertain future climate. Because we know that although Africa did not contribute so much to climate change now, it will, and it is already suffering the most impacts from unfavorable climate. So the African Climate Resilient Investment Facility, AFRIRES, is aimed at strengthening the capacity of African countries and institutions, project developers, to integrate climate information and services into planning, design, and implementation of infrastructure investments so as to enhance their performance and also their resilience to climate variability and change. The sectors chosen, mainly energy, water, transport, agriculture, are also the infrastructure areas that many African countries have identified for climate action in their nationally determined contributions to climate action under the framework of the Paris Agreement on Climate Change. Specifically, AFRIRES will provide project-level technical assistance to project developers, including specifications for carrying out climate resilient assessments, and also providing additional support to seeking incremental financing for upfront integration of climate resilience in project design and implementation. 2, AFRIRES will carry out outreach advocacy training on climate resilient infrastructure planning, design, and implementation. 3, it will produce and disseminate guidelines, standards, and good practice notes for climate resilient infrastructure investments, and it would provide climate knowledge and data portal to assist with ready access to climate data, models, and other tools, as emphasized in Ms. Schneider-Roos's presentation. So I'll stop there on my reflections, and thank you very much. I apologize that I couldn't make it in person, and I hope that you were able to hear me. Thank you.